I've been writing software for over 20 years at this point, and for a large portion of that time, I have been building front-end applications with many different things. But I've built things with Vue, I've built things with React, and I've developed my preferences and opinions over all this time of building lots of different software. And there's been a lot of dialogue recently comparing Vue and React, but in this video, I just want to show the code. I want to dive in and I want to compare some things that I have implemented in both React and in Vue. Now, you might be wondering, why should I care? Ultimately, I just want you to see some real-world examples, because when you see things on Twitter, very often it's a small image or maybe something in 280 characters or less, and there's a lot more nuance that can't be conveyed in 280 characters or less because we're all typically working on more complex applications. And so in this video, I want to dive into the code and really show you how things are done in both Vue and React. So this video is going to be the first in a multi-part series where I show how I implemented the same application in both Vue and React. And today's video is all about this sign-up form here. Now, this is mainly demonstrating how we deal with state updates in a component, and also how we can define the template both in JSX and in Vue's templating syntax. But for instance, we have field validation. Whenever a user tabs out, it'll show as valid. If it's valid, we can submit the form. It'll validate the entire form. So it's a fairly simple example, but this is really going to demonstrate state updates and also be a comparison of template syntax. In future videos, I'm going to cover these other examples. So we also have a shop. So we have a products page with two products. We have a cart page. And we need to be able to share state between these two pages and also be able to display the status of the cart here. So if I add something to the cart, you can see the status is displayed. I can add multiple things. That should update the quantity. If I go to the cart page, you can see that it has that data, and I can also adjust the state of the cart from the cart page, and I can also add other things to the cart as well. So this is mainly a demonstration of how do we share state in an application when we have multiple pages and multiple places in our app all need to be able to access that data and also modify it. Another example I have is an image search application. So this lets you type in a search term. This will hit an API, give back a list of images, and then we also have pagination, so we can look at the next page and previous page of images. And this example is mainly demonstrating how do we do asynchronous API requests inside of our components, how we do state updates, and then also I'll show how I implemented the pagination here. The last example I have here is a stocks example. So this allows you to type in some stock symbols. It then reaches out to the Yahoo Finance API and shows real-time updates of stock price information. But we can add multiple here and kind of just build out a little stock ticker dashboard. You can see that it's actually validating the stock symbols before it adds them. So that's reaching out to an API. And really, this is just demonstrating how do we deal with highly interactive and asynchronous applications, right? Because all of these charts are all receiving socket updates at different times. We need to be able to update the charts, keep track of that state. And we also have a fairly complex component hierarchy as well. So this example is really going to show the differences between how you implement highly interactive client applications with both Vue and React. But like I said, we're going to focus on the sign-up form for today. If you have any suggestions for more complex client apps that you think would make for a good comparison between Vue and React, let us know down in the comments. But without further ado, let's jump into the code. My name is CJ. Welcome to Syntax. Now let's take a look at the signup example. Now, you may not think that this is that complex, but when you're dealing with client-side validation and form state, things can get tricky. And for instance, I want to be able to show a form error and show an invalid state on a field if a user tabs away. I want to do the same thing and show that it's valid if a user tabs away, and also show errors when the form is submitted. So there's a lot to keep track of here. Now, for both of these examples, I am using Zod. So Zod is a schema validation library. Basically, I defined my form schema here, and then I'm using this to validate the form. I created a bunch of helper methods and like helper types that we can use, but beyond Zod, there's no other library used in these examples. Now, if we take a look at React, let's see how we set up all of this state. In React, we have the use state hook, and we can pass in an initial value here, and then we have two things. We have the state value itself, and then we have a function we can call if we want to update that state value. Now, I have form submitted, which defaults to false, but when you submit the form, we set it to true, but this lets me know if I should show the errors or not, because when the page loads, you don't want to show the errors. We also have the form field errors. So basically, for any field, if there is an error message, it will exist on this object, but if there's not, it won't. So it defaults to the empty object because there are no errors when the page loads, but as the user tabs through or submits the form, this is going to get populated with all of the error messages. And the other thing is to keep track of whether or not a user has touched a field, we have the form touch field. So It has all the fields of the form, but then this is either true if the user has touched the field or undefined if they haven't touched it at all. So this also starts off as an empty object. And then the form state itself is just an object with all of the fields from the form and their initial values. So nothing too crazy here, but let's take a look at how we define the state inside of Vue. So in Vue, we have two different things we can use to define state. One of them is ref. Now, you technically can use this to store DOM element refs like you do in React, but typically a ref is used to create a single reactive value, often for like a primitive value like a Boolean here. So form submitted is a ref that defaults to false. And then we have the same form errors, but here we're using reactive. So reactive allows you to declare a reactive object, but with reactive, I can just modify this object directly. So I could say like form errors.email equals email is required or whatever else. And so reactive is pretty nice when you are dealing with an object. So we're using reactive for both the errors of the form and then also whether or not those fields are touched, and then the initial form state here. Now, the major difference here is that we don't have a setter function. In Vue, we are able to mutate our state. So for any one of these values, if I want to change it, I can just write the code to change it. So that's how our state is defined. Let's see how we access it in the render function. So here in React, we are going to look at the form here, and we have lots of inputs, right? We have an input for email, an input for first name, an input for last name. But for each one of these, I'm binding the specific value, right? And that value is coming from form state. So as the user types into each input field, that's getting updated on state, and we're binding it to each of these inputs. In order to update that state, we have the onChange DOM event. So here, whenever the email input changes, we want to set that value on our state. And for that, we have a helper function here called setField. And the way I've written this is with just some TypeScript types that basically gives us good type safety here. So we pass in the specific property that we want to set, and then we pass the value that we're going to be setting it to. And so this is nice because I can reuse this for all of my inputs, right? I have it for first name, for last name, for username, etc. But if we look at that function, we can look and see how we actually update the state. And we're using that setFormState function, right? So this is the setter function that got passed back from useState. And for any given field that I pass in here and value, we need to update it on the object. But in React, our state updates are immutable. So we have to return a copy of the object. So I'm taking the current form state, spreading it into this object, and then updating that specific value of that specific property that we passed in. So again, you could ignore all this TypeScript stuff here. Basically, this function is nice and reusable so that on any of one of my inputs, I can just specify the field name and it will automatically update the state. Now, a major difference in Vue is that we don't have to do all of this manually. So in Vue, on our inputs, we have this vModel directive. So this is something provided by Vue that basically is a shorthand for specifying the value binding and the onChange listener. And so you can see that I'm actually just passing in directly formState.email. Behind the scenes, Vue is going to add that change listener, update the state when it needs to, and this is all that I need. So this is one nice thing about Vue is some of the stuff you do most often, it provides little helpers so you don't have to write as much code. So for the Vue example, I don't have to write that custom setField function, and we don't have to do an immutable state update. So behind the scenes, it's literally just reaching in and setting these properties. It's literally saying formState.email equals something, right? So whenever that onChange event gets fired, it's basically setting this to like e.target.value. But we don't have to do an immutable state update. We can modify it directly, and behind the scenes, Vue is able to see when these change, and it's able to re-render our render function here if those values do change. Now, let's take a look at some of these other things here, because if this is your first time seeing a Vue template, it probably looks pretty weird, but this is how we set up DOM events, right? So in React, we have special camel-cased names for every possible DOM event on an element. On insert DOM event name, we have access to all of those. And the convention in React is all of them are camel-cased, and then we can pass in a callback function. In Vue, we can use the @ sign. So whenever you see the @ sign, you know that this specifically is a DOM event. And similarly, I can do @ I get access to all of those specific DOM events. And actually, this is a shorthand. So without the @ sign, you can say v_on and then specify the DOM event. But we do that so often that Vue has provided the @ sign shorthand. And then anything inside these double quotes is an expression that's going to be evaluated whenever that event fires. And so I have a helper method on blur that's going to set that specific field to blurred. The other thing is if we are binding just regular DOM attributes to some expression, we use a colon. So by default, you can see my syntax highlighter is kind of like helping us out here. If I didn't have this colon here, then I would just be passing this string to aria invalid. But if I want Vue to actually evaluate the expression inside the double quotes, then I put a colon here, and you can see that now this is going to evaluate it as an expression. Now in React, we can just use curly braces to denote that this will be an expression. So I will say in Vue, this takes some getting used to, but these are the simple rules that you can follow. If you see an @ it's a DOM event. If you see a colon, it's being bound to an expression. If you see v dash something, it is a custom directive that has some built-in functionality. Now, another thing to look at here is conditional rendering. So in Vue, if we want to conditionally render this error message here, we're using v-if. And so this is another built-in directive. We see that v-. And if this evaluates to truthy, it will render this element. If it's falsy, that element will not be rendered out. In React, we just use JavaScript expressions to define our conditional. So in this case, we're saying if email is truthy, then we will render out the element on the right-hand side. And then to actually access expressions inside of elements, in Vue, we use handlebars. So these double curly braces here are handlebars. Anything inside of that is an expression. In JSX, anything inside of the curly braces here can be an expression. Now, the last thing I'll show you to compare here is onBlur. So if we look at onBlur here inside of React, whenever the user tabs out of a field, we want to validate that one specific field, set the error message if it's not invalid, and then also set touch to true for that one specific property. So here, when we blur an input, getFieldError is just a helper method that I wrote where you can pass in the property name and the value. It's going to run the validator for that one field and give us back an error message. And so if there is an error message, that means this field is invalid. If it's undefined, there's no error there. But you can see here, this is another immutable state update. So for the form errors, we're needing to spread the previous state and then update that one specific field error. And then for touched fields, we need to spread the previous state and then update true for that one specific property. Now in Vue, like I said, we can do mutable state updates. And so this is a little bit simpler because we can just reach into the form errors here and set it. We don't have to do any sort of spreading or immutable update. And same thing with touched fields. Now, that's most of what I want to show in this comparison. There's a lot more we could dive into, but one thing I'll talk about before we do move on is the difference in rendering between React and Vue. So in React, we have a single function here, right? And so anytime our state updates, this whole function is going to rerun and it's going to return a virtual DOM tree. But it is important to note that every time this render function runs, all of the code inside it has to run too. So that means we're actually like redeclaring all of these functions every time it re-renders. But it is something you can forget about when you're working in React is like all the stuff we define up here are function declarations. These are going to get redefined every time this function runs again, right? That's just how JavaScript works. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is important to note that that's what's happening. And you do need to know that basically these things are getting recreated over and over again. Now, in Vue, that doesn't happen. So in Vue, our codes are split up into our script and our template. Our script, you can think of like when the component is created. So when the component is created is where we actually define all of these state values and all of our methods, but that code only ever runs once when the component is created. We define our template down here, but this actually gets turned into a virtual DOM render function. So I mean, it looks like HTML, but at the end of the day, the code that you're shipping to the browser for using a build process, you're getting a render function that doesn't redeclare all this stuff on every render. It basically just has access to all of that stuff in scope, but still returns a virtual DOM tree based on that. Now, I'm not arguing that one is better than the other, but it is a different way to think about things, right? Because when you're working in React, you always have to remember that, yes, this stuff is going to run over and over again. But in Vue, we've kind of separated things out. So we know that the stuff defined here is only going to run once, and then this template is basically what's going to be updated based on if our state changes. So to summarize, probably the main differences here between Vue and React are how we define state. So in React, these are all getter setter functions. And then in Vue, we have reactive variables that we can just modify directly. And then in order to actually render things out, we're using a different kind of syntax. So in React, we're using JSX, which has its various rules. And then in Vue, we're using its template syntax, which has its special directives and @DOM events and ways of binding expressions. Now, for a lot of people, they may stop here. They may say, I do not like how Vue does this, so I'm not even going to touch it. But in these other examples that I'm going to show you, we're going to dive into other things that aren't just the template syntax and state updates. There are other aspects of building front-end applications where I think we can really note the differences and see the different approaches that both Vue and React take. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, definitely subscribe, click that notification bell so you can be alerted next week when I drop the next video in this series where we dive into this shop example and we really demonstrate how do we share state across multiple components in our application. I'm also going to make a plug for the Syntax Snack Pack, which is our bi-weekly newsletter, because we have new merch coming soon that you'll be able to buy. But if you sign up for the newsletter, you'll get a 15% off code. And the newsletter is super cool. It comes out every 2 weeks and just has a few tasty clicks, few things that will keep you entertained. We don't spam you. It's pretty slick. So yeah, sub to the newsletter, get your coupon code, and keep an eye on the swag store. So if you go to syntax.fm, click on swag, that'll take you to the shop. And sometime next week, you'll be able to buy this shirt and a few others as well. So that's all I got for you. I'll see you in the next one.